Hi, and welcome to my channel, Laura's Library Card. So today I'm going to be doing a book review on The Birch Incident by Marla Holt. I got this book as an ARC through NetGalley, and my intention had been to get it done before it was published, but that was like a day ago, so whatever. This will be one of the first reviews of it out there. It came out on May 21st, so it should be available to purchase now. So the Birch Incident is a contemporary romance, and the main character is named Van Birch, and she is a not even a pop star. She's a singer, songwriter, sort of Taylor Swift similar, but she's definitely more like bluesy. But I essentially thought of her as like a Taylor Swift character for this whole book, and she's mega famous. She's got millions of followers. She has her own reality TV show. She's a famous singer-songwriter, a household name as she claims to be. So it's not really a spoiler because in the very first chapter / prologue, the incident that happens, the Van Birch incident, is that Van is raped by her manager. It's not super explicit. It's sort of we see where it's headed, and then it's like fade to black, and then we start chapter 1. But that happens right up front and is the Van Birch incident. So the rest of the book is Van trying to come to grips with what has happened to her and also sort of recover from the trauma. Like the night after the incident, there's a tornado also that rips through her hometown. So she was in LA, her hometown is in Kansas, and this tornado has decimated a big portion of the town, and a lot of people don't have any homes. So she leaves LA to go home to both recover from this incident that just happened and get away from her manager who was her attacker, and also to kind of rebuild her hometown and connect with her father. She goes home to Kansas. The main male character is Clay Noble, who is technically Van's stepbrother. Their parents got married when they were both teenagers, and they had known each other, sort of before their parents got married. But Clay is the romantic love interest. Clay is a builder and a contractor, so he has a lot of business suddenly, and his own home was destroyed in the tornado. Thankfully, he was fine and his dog was fine, but he's going to have to rebuild, and he is struggling with Van's coming into town because he has had feelings for her forever and ever, and he is struggling with what has happened to her and how he can be a part of her life after she has suffered through this rape and attack. So overall, I actually really enjoyed this book. I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, maybe even 4, so if I just continue to reflect on that. Reasons why I like the book is that I really liked Marla Holt's writing. It was written in sort of a third person, but it was an omniscient point of view, and we kept switching between Clay and Van's point of view. And so it's one of my favorite things when romance books show both the male and female perspective, and I felt like the writing was really realistic. Both Clay's thoughts and especially Van's struggles, those come through very clearly, and the language that both of them use in conversation and in their thoughts is very consistent with what we hear them think internally, and it's really kind of fun. Like Van's humor and wry, there's a lot of wry, dry humor happening between a lot of the characters as they banter, so that was sort of a way to lighten things. So the characters, especially our two main characters, are Van and Clay, and I felt that they were really strongly written. They both felt really real. I really appreciated Van's struggles throughout the whole book. She kind of, at first, is sort of suffering from reliving the attack in her mind, and certain times she kind of is overwhelmed by the feelings, and that fear keeps coming back, and then over the course of the book that starts to lessen a little bit, and we really get to see internally her own struggles. And I personally have not undergone a trauma this way, but it felt so real because the person who had hurt Van was somebody that she felt she was in love with, and somebody who she'd been in a relationship for like a year, and she'd known Bishop for a long time before that because he was her manager. So she had really trusted Bishop and really loved him, and was like had to get over the shock that this had happened to her. And we really got to see a lot of Van's own self-doubt as she sort of took time to really reframe her relationship with Bishop in her mind. She goes through moments of kind of guilt for remembering when like times were good, and she tries to come to grips with the fact that she does have these, positive, good memories of her relationship with Bishop, but then ultimately he has like betrayed her. And as she, kind of goes to therapy, and as she starts working through things, she sees how much of a manipulator he was of their entire relationship. So I really liked how we saw Van throughout her whole process of, throughout the start of this process where she is trying to figure out what happened to her and why it happened. And she definitely goes through moments of self-doubt and guilt and shame. And she ultimately comes back and is like, you know what? No, like I've never let fear rule my life before. I'm not going to start now. And we really see her, like, even though she's not 100% back to normal, she's not over it, she still has this trauma. She like takes the reins of her own life. And that was really great to see in her whole character arc. The other main character is Clay, and sort of from the very beginning of the book, we know that Clay has always had feelings for Van, and he is in love with her. And so when he hears about the rape, he is like so angry, but also so worried for Van because he loves her and he wants her to be well, and he regrets that he wasn't there for her. But we also get to like see him kind of come to terms with that, and it sort of fuels his protective drive for Van. And there's also an incident that had happened years previously where Clay had said some words that he didn't really mean. He was just kind of being a jerk. And Van had overheard that, and they'd really wounded Van at that young age, but Clay had never known that he had hurt her. So I liked that he kind of acknowledged that this has happened, and Clay takes the time to acknowledge that had hurt her. And we really see him not just like, I'm a love interest, I'm an alpha guy. Like we see a lot of Clay's thinking about things, and he has a lot of feelings too that I felt came across really well. The other major characters in the book are sort of secondary characters, but they were all great. Bryant is the best friend of Clay and has been the long-term boyfriend of Van, and it's been a fake relationship from the start. And so Van kind of used Bryant up front, like they made this arrangement, but Van used Bryant as a way to kind of be in a long-term relationship and kind of have this sort of security blanket and a buffer between herself and other people, so she wouldn't be taken advantage of when she went into the music world and industry. We got a real sense of loyalty from Bryant. He was a really great best friend. He was really loyal to Van on paper. I mean, yes, Van and Bryant both had like affairs or whatever, sort of, on the DL. They both have slept with other people over the past couple of years. But Brian's just like a really interesting character, and we can really see how much he cares about Van and how much he cares about Clay, and how he was sort of in this arranged relationship even at his own detriment, and we saw his loyalty. Robin is Van's father, and he is really supportive of her whole career. He's just like the best dad. He's also a lawyer. So he is just like, his entire role throughout the book is just to be so supportive of Van and to be like wanting vengeance for her. And he helps ground Van. They play the piano together and they sing together. So Robin is just like a great father figure. Phoenix is a great best friend. Phoenix has Van's back at all times, and she is just like this like wildcat who's just like she has her own personal kind of reasons and traumatic past that we find out throughout the book, which is part of why she doesn't really love Clay, but she is 100% there for Van throughout the whole book. And it was just really great to have this like mama bear Wolverine best friend who always came to bat for Van. And the last character I'm going to mention is Minnie, a woman who runs the local coffee shop in the hometown in Kansas and who had a previous relationship with Bryant. And we don't see a ton of Minnie's perspective. She is really just there to like be another friend source for Van. But I felt like it was very clear that the author was setting up a future book for Bryant and Minnie like together because they had this past. One element of the book's format that I really enjoyed and felt enhanced the book is that in between every chapter, there's a quick, short little tweet or news article or blog post at some sort of social media that is sort of describing what's happening in the world, like because Van is a megastar. And at the beginning, those are like, oh, like Van was seen with, you know, hunky manager Bishop. But then as soon as the incident has happened, we see mostly this vitriol from the internet as people are immediately convinced that Van is making all of this up and that she's accusing Bishop of rape as a publicity stunt. And throughout the book, there are these tweets that just get like nastier and nastier, like made me uncomfortable, but like they're real. I think they're like real tweets that the author like did research and, you know, made up usernames, but like they're real tweets. And they talk about wanting to like come after Van and how, you know, and they slut shame her and death threats, rape threats. You know, it was so, it really drove home how nasty there are of people in the world. There's even a line about how Van says this is supposed to be like a Me Too, you know, movement and people are supposed to be more aware and should be listening to women, and yet she still receives thousands and thousands of comments and tweets that are against her and that don't believe her. And it shows how many people were on Bishop's side, even though he was the attacker. This is the spoiler section, so if you have not read this and don't want to know some spoilers, now's the time to be done. Thanks. So the taboo nature of this being a stepbrother, stepsister romance, I thought that was going to be a problem, and it really was not addressed very much, I don't think. Not like directly. Both Van and Clay had crushes on each other at the very young age, you know, before they were moved in together and were siblings. And so neither of them ever had viewed the other person as a sibling. And even though they both kind of struggled, it was very minimally, and they both already had feelings in place. And so they never really like had a talk or was like, you know, really addressed any issues. They just kind of were like, yeah, I know that was the role we were supposed to be in, but like, I always kind of like had a thing for you, so I never thought of you as a sibling. Other people, for the most, other people in the book don't seem to care. Robin doesn't seem to care. Phoenix has a prejudice against Clay for the things that Clay said in the past, but did not tell Van to stay away from Clay because Clay was her stepbrother. Phoenix told Van to stay away from Clay because she thought Clay was a jerk. Bryant is 100% supportive. He kind of teases Clay about like, you should have made it happen sooner. It's really only the internet and the tabloids who run with this. And so I felt like, on the one hand, part of me was like, this sort of should have been addressed a little bit more. It should have been more of a thing that the characters kind of struggled to push through. But at the same time, I think that if there had been too much of that on the page, it might have turned off the reader more. I don't know. I felt like it was kind of a non-issue, and like part of me, the science part of me is like, whatever, they're step siblings, there's no genetics involved, who cares if they like each other? And then the other side of me is kind of like, yeah, but that's kind of gross. So I thought that it was handled really well because it never came across as like icky to me. A couple other little nitpicky things is that I think there were typos because I had an arc, but those jumped out at me. So this was a slow burn romance, and there was really good tension sort of building up throughout, but there was only one actual sex scene, and I felt like it was sort of like okay. It wasn't too explicit, it wasn't too steamy, it was just sort of like, yes, they're doing it, they're talking during it, and they enjoy it, but it's not this like long ongoing graphic like scene. Based on how much description there had been and certain word choices that had been used while the tension has been building, I sort of expected a little bit more steam in the sex scene. It was sort of stated from the beginning that Clay had always had feelings for Van. He's been in love with her since before the start of the book, potentially since before they even moved in together, even though Clay was only like 16. I would have almost preferred to see their love and feelings develop on page as opposed to kind of have this smothered ember that's been fanned into flame. I think it would have been a little bit more. This is sort of my number one complaint with romances is that like the characters love each other and I'm like, yeah, but why? Like what about them? And I think that Clay and Van were drawn so well, but I wish that they had both like had this lust in place that they'd always denied, and then they worked and then as they, connected in this time together in the book, that's when they like developed feelings. But I still thought it was good because they love each other and they get a happily ever after. But, that's my own personal thing. With regards to plot, there really isn't that much plot because the whole point is that it's characters falling in love and it's about the characters. That being said, there is a scene at the end, like toward the end, where Van is kidnapped and everyone is freaking out because she's been kidnapped. But like, I didn't really understand the point of this scene because Van doesn't have an opportunity to confront the guys who did this to her, one of whom is Bishop. She doesn't do anything to get herself out of it. She just is taken and wakes up and is terrified, and then like the police bust in. So the whole point of the kidnap scene was to have more legal fodder against Bishop, I guess. I don't know, it didn't really like do much for me, and I didn't think it was super relevant, but well foreshadowed. The very last chapter is a happily ever after moment where Clay's like, this is where I'm going to build our house because we're going to be married. And I didn't really feel that a marriage proposal, and the very last page is like the very last social media blurb. And it was like, oh, the wedding was so beautiful. Is that a baby bump? I didn't feel like that was really necessary. I would have been totally happy if the two had just decided to commit to each other and be in a relationship as opposed to needing that now we're engaged and have a marriage arrangement. But whatever, it was a happily ever after and it ended well. So like I said, I really enjoyed the Van Birch Incident. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. And I highly recommend you check out this book because I want to read more of Marla Holt. She's on my list. Thanks for watching. Bye.